Okay, let's see if everything works the way it's supposed to, like it worked at home. Okay. Machine here. Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for letting me brief today. This is the first public presentation of this that I've done, and as you have heard, I wrote a book. So I'm going to talk about that book a little bit today. Thank you to David for taping this for me, because as I say, this is my first time doing this, and I'll probably be doing some more things, and I'd like to really would welcome your feedback afterwards as to whether this was enjoyable or not. This is going to be a little different than the normal topics we talk about in class, but I'm going to make it relevant to the class, as you'll see in a minute. My book, Leading to Win, is a leadership model that I developed over several years. And I realize most of the people in this class are not looking for new leadership tips at this point in our lives, but again, I'm going to make it relevant with the way I wrote the book. And I'd also point out over here, get this thing to work. There's a few original drawings that you're going to see throughout the briefing. They're actually in the book, and they were done by Alex Salazar, who's a young lady at our church, very talented young lady. So she helped me with this as well. Okay, before I delve into the book itself, you might be interested a little bit about how it came to be. And let's start with the author and his backstory. Many of you do know that we were part of a military family for a long time. I went to the Air Force Academy for college. I majored in political science and history, and even though history was my secondary major, it really was my real passion. And I continued to study and read history really my whole life. So I've accumulated a lot of interesting knowledge about military history that I was able to bring out in the book. I also served for 24 years. We retired in 2012, and then we moved down here. So during that time, I met a lot of people, went to a lot of places, had a lot of unique experiences, and I also had the opportunity regularly to see and to personally execute multiple different leadership styles. And so again, I've assembled a bunch of different lessons and learnings, some the very hard way, that I hope to bring into here. So about a year ago, I got to the idea and said, okay, I want to take all these ideas and all these things, and maybe I could put it into a comprehensive book. And that sounded great. And then I kind of looked in the mirror and said, well, how am I supposed to do that? And then one day, out of nowhere, into my head popped up the subtitle that I used in the book. And the subtitle is The Model for Great Leadership as Demonstrated by Military History and the Messiah. That's pretty quirky, and it came out of nowhere, so I think it was implanted there from above, because it wasn't something I would have come up with just thinking about it. But there in one moment, there was the model for how I was going to do the book. And I said, well, that's really neat. Somebody sees that kind of eclectic title, might draw them in closer to want to find out what this is about. And then I said, okay, I have no idea what that means and no idea how I'm going to make that work. So I had to think about this for quite a while. And then I finally did come up with a construct that I hope works. I took my personal experiences about how I learned various different leadership lessons and used those stories as kind of the introduction to the lesson in each chapter. And then I took the military anecdotes, so especially some of the really neat ones that people may not know that much about, and I pulled them in as illustrations of each of the points that I was making. And then at the end of each main chapter, I have an ongoing, what I call the Messiah case study, where I will look at how Jesus, the man, during his earthly ministry, used these same principles I'm talking about on an important mission. And so that's what I'm going to focus most of my time on today, is talking about how that case study applies. And I hope you'll enjoy looking at Jesus from a slightly different perspective than we normally do. Okay, the original core inspiration for the book started many, many years ago. I was a young captain in the mid-90s working at the headquarters of the Air Education and Training Command, which is at Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio. That was my first time living in Texas. And that's why we're back, because we liked it so much. I had the good luck to work for this guy, Colonel Virgil Monty, at the time. He was in the final assignment of a 30-year career. He was a great mentor to me, and to this day we are still really good friends of our family. After a project I was working for him one day, he made this comment to me kind of offhand, and I've never forgot it. He said, if you want a task done right, then assign the right person to do it. Just a very simple mantra of how you can be successful as a leader. I kind of remembered that, and I thought about it for years and years afterwards, and as I got to be more senior, I realized there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I also realized I kind of do this well. And so when I got to be a senior officer and junior officers would come to me and say, what's the secret? What how do I be more effective leader? I would often just repeat this over and over and over again, because this book was designed to teach people how to do that better. Okay. So before I get into the leadership principles, we got to level set a few definitions I used in the book so that I could be consistent. And here's where you get to participate. Everybody take a moment. Think of 2 or 3 people that you would nominate as the greatest leaders of the 20th century. No other criteria, just who pops into your head as the greatest leaders of the 20th century.
Winston Churchill would be the top of my list.
Everybody got a couple? Here's the 3 that I came up with. Good call there. I was going to ask who came up with one of these, maybe. Okay, so a couple people shared one of them. Anybody got 2? Okay, 2. Anybody got all 3? That's what I figured. The assumption is that people would not have the top 3. He was the Russian commander in World War II. Brilliant military leader, who probably most of you have not heard of, because that's not in your area of expertise. I'm going to automatically look for a military leader when I think about this question, right? And that's kind of my point, is if we took everybody's list and brought it up here and compared it, I would argue that it would be very unlikely that anybody would have the same 3 names. Simply because this is a very, very subjective question that we've asked. We all have a different perspective on what are the qualities of good leaders, right? And if we're asking who's a great leader, that's even harder, because even if we're looking at the same person, one person's going to say this is a great leader and the other person's going to say this is a villain. So to take that subjectivity out of it, I said I've got to narrow this down and use a specifically narrow definition of what I'm going to call great leadership for this book. And the idea of what that is came to me from another senior officer who was giving a briefing. Again, I was a young officer. A general came in to brief us, and he was talking about, imagine that, leadership. And during the briefing, he said this: a leader's #1 priority is to prepare the next generation of leaders. We'd never really heard anything like that before. Took it home, thought about it, and I certainly had to agree that's really important to do. But I finally came to the conclusion that, no, I think the general's wrong here. I don't think that's the #1 priority. I think it's important. I said, I think the #1 priority is accomplishing today's mission, or that is, you're put in a position to lead so that you can deliver something in the here and now. And so I made my definition of successful leadership this, and this is what I use throughout the book: the ability to lead a team to do an important task right. And great leaders are simply the people that do that consistently, especially with challenging tasks. So that's how I used great leadership in the book. People could argue, what about all the other qualities of leadership? And as I point out, that's subject for another book. This is very focused on the ability to do this. And one last definition: your ability to do these tasks right, that's what I call winning in the book. And that's what the title's about: leading to win, leading so that you can deliver. And the book, again, is designed so that leaders can think about developing habits that can allow them to accomplish almost any task. And as it turns out, the task is the first element of leading to win. And this is a good place for me to stop and talk about the big task that I used in the case study, so that you have that basis. We all know why Jesus came down to earth, right? He came down to be with us. He came down to teach us, to sacrifice himself on the cross, and thereby save our souls. That was his task from God, and he did it to perfection. But even though he did all that, that didn't guarantee our salvation, because all of us have to claim the salvation. We have to put our faith in Jesus, and that's what God wants us to do. So Jesus had to think about, I'm getting this following, I'm getting the word out, but I'm not going to be here pretty soon. So I need a mechanism that is going to be able to continue after I'm gone, that is going to get the word out about my teachings and tell people how to claim their salvation. In other words, Jesus knew he needed to launch a church with a big C. And so that is the focus of the task, and you'll see as we go through it how that's what he was trying to do. Okay. I would argue that leaders who win do so because they get the task right up front. That seems common sense, but it's not always common practice. Let me give you one of my stories of a colleague told me. She came in one day really, really frustrated because she said, my commander is driving me crazy. Her commander was Major Nebulous, okay? She and the people in her unit would get called into Major Nebulous's office, and he'd start to have this expansive vision and very vague description of something he wanted done. And he'd close that by saying to her, I don't really know what I want, but I'll know it when I see it, so go do it. Okay? Has anybody worked with or around a Major Nebulous before? I see a couple nods. Was it fun? Did the team operate efficiently? No, it was, they weren't winning, they were spinning, right? I would argue it's not only frustrating for people, it's just plain bad leadership. If a leader has to ask his people, what is it that I want? He's really not leading, right? So leaders who win frame their taskings, and that's the first principle I talk about in the book. And a framing is simply telling the task person, here's the guidance and support you need to accomplish the task I'm giving you. I recommend, if it's an all complex task, do it in writing. Do a written framing document. It doesn't have to be long, and it can be any format you want. I don't recommend a particular format. I say the leader and his team should figure out what format works for them. But I do recommend whatever format you use, it includes four key points. The first one is the objective statement. This is the crux of your task. This tells you what you're doing. It tells you what the end state is for success, and sometimes it adds context for why you're doing the task. It can be a few words long. It can be multiple paragraphs long, depending on how much detail you have and whether you want to include subtasks. But whether it's long, short, with subtext, without subtext, whatever format it's in, it has to be clear. A leader who gives his team a universally understood objective statement is already halfway to the win. A leader who gives an objective statement that is muddled and confusing is putting the team behind the 8 ball before they even start. Okay, so how did the Messiah do the objective statement? As far as I know, he did not use a written framing document. But I do know that he talked about, he gave us a very clear objective in 2 different verses in the Bible. And this is the first one. Would somebody read it for me?
Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you.
Okay, we all know that verse. It's a fairly bold statement, right? And notice there's 3 subtasks. He tells the disciples to go, baptize in the name of the Trinity, and teach Jesus' words. And he also tells them this is for all nations. So it's starting to get to be a pretty big task, but he's not done. Here's another verse from Acts. Anybody want to help me with that one?
You will be my witness in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth.
So here he clarifies where they're to go, to the ends of the earth. So if we summarize these 2 into one consolidated statement, he has said to the apostles, you are to reach all people in all nations to the ends of the earth. And oh, by the way, you're going to have to set this up so that you can reach all future people because they all have to be saved too. If you think about it, that is probably the most ambitious framing ever issued in history. And the apostles were probably looking at him at that point saying, right. Fortunately for them, there's a couple more elements in the framing that are going to help them out. And the next one is milestones and timelines. This is simply the idea of taking the big pieces of the project and just kind of lining them up and saying, you need to have this piece done by here, and this piece done by here, and this piece done by here. It's not meant to be a program plan. If any of you are familiar with project planning, it's not meant to be detailed. It's very high level. It's just, here's a couple of key things you have to do along the way, when it should be done, and that tells the team if they're on track. Resources is the next point. And I can promise you this, if you want your task to fail, if you want to sabotage your own task, don't resource it. Okay, so it's really important that the team know this is what I have and this is what I don't have. And a simple list here is all you need to include in the framing document. So as it turns out, Jesus addressed both of those points in a single verse. Someone else can help me.
Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised, which you currently speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so he ties this together, and he tells them, first, the milestone and timeline, just one. The apostles are to wait for a few days. That's their timeline, and they're to wait to Pentecost. After which he promises he's going to give them the only resource they're going to need, the Holy Spirit. Well, the apostles did what Jesus asked. They waited. Pentecost came, and Jesus, as he always does, fulfilled his promise, delivered the Holy Spirit, and then they were off to the races. I think you all know that in Acts, Luke reports that Peter went out and preached and converted, 3,000 people the first day. So these guys, on the first day, were already off to building the church. All right, and the final point that I recommend being in the framing is one that a lot of people don't think about, and this is authorities. You need to tell everybody involved who has authority on the task and what the scope of that authority is. Because authority matters to people. Think about how many times the Pharisees came up to Jesus in a huff and said, "By what authority are you preaching this?" That was very important to them, that he had the proper authority to be preaching. Likewise, the people that he was preaching to, how many times did we hear about them saying how they were amazed because he taught with one as authority? So authority carries some gravitas that helps you get things done. I think it's also important to lay that out in the framing document because it prevents what I call the two sins of authority misuse. The first one, you're probably all familiar with. This is when somebody who does not have authority comes up to you and tries to pretend he does. And again, I would ask, has anybody had that happen to them? and I would ask, what is your reaction to that? Are you, hey, how can I help you? Probably not. It's probably like, you don't, I don't work for you. I got other things to do. So that's a problem if somebody doesn't know what their authority is and they're trying, or they're just trying to overstep it. By putting in the framing, you lay that out. The second sin is less well known, but I think it's even more dangerous. And that's when somebody does have the authority, but they won't use it. Again, I know you've worked with people like that before, and I recommend in the book that any leader who sees the person he gave authority to that is afraid or unwilling to use it, he needs to take it away from them and give it to somebody else, because indecisiveness and timidity do not allow you to win. All right, but Jesus addressed authority too. Again, one simple sentence. Anybody over here can read that?
If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven.
So once again, Jesus has given the disciples a lot of authority. He's essentially delegated all of his own earthly powers to the apostles. So big tasks require big authorities, and Jesus, again, does not disappoint. Okay, let's shift gears a minute. So we've talked about the task, which is the thing you need to do. But it's people who are going to notch the win for you and accomplish the task. So I've got a couple principles to talk about your people. All right, principle number 2 is know your people. Now that sounds like a simple principle, but it may not be so simple. I've seen a lot of leaders who spend a lot of time getting to know their people on a very personal level, and I'm all for that. I don't criticize that at all. But they sometimes assume that, hey, once I know them on a personal level, now I know how to employ them effectively. Meanwhile, some people on their teams are running around thinking to themselves, he has no idea what I could do for his team if he would let me, or what was she thinking giving me this task? It just shows that he understood them as people, but didn't really understand them in the way I mean know your people here, which is about building a profile of an individual's strengths and their abilities. And I talk about this in 3 dimensions. There's strengths, which are things that you're obviously good at, and you've clearly demonstrated. There are gaps, which we don't really know yet if you're good at or not. And those are great opportunities to try to develop somebody, because you can make it a strength if it's something that they just never had the opportunity to grow into. And then there are weaknesses. And weaknesses are the things that you simply can't do right. Don't take weakness as a negative, pejorative term here. It's just the way I'm classifying it, because all of us have weaknesses, things that they're simply not in us to do, right? And if any of you doubt that, have a talk with your spouse on the way back from church. I think they'll verify that we all have weaknesses, right? And it's important for the leader to know what his people's weaknesses are, and for those people to acknowledge them. And then don't spend time trying to turn weaknesses into strength. Once you've proven that this is just not in your DNA, you're wasting valuable time you can spend on things that can become strengths. Now there's several different strategies you can use to get to know your people, right? And here's a couple of them here. The last 2, the teaching and the stretching, also are really good at also developing strengths at the same time. So as you're getting to know your people, you can also say, I got a gap here. As I get to know them, let's see if I can turn it into a strength. And so how did Jesus use these know your people and grow your people strategies? Okay, face-to-face time. He was with them all the time, right? They traveled together, they ate together, they prayed together, they performed miracles together. If you watched, anybody watch The Chosen? I know people have talked about it. I find that as a very interesting element of the way the writers have done that. That intimacy of them living together is really kind of central to the whole theme. So that's a really good description of how he spent face-to-face time with them. With that much time with them, he's going to get to know everything about them. Setting expectations for observation of performance. He tells the parable of the sower, which I know you all know this one too, right? There's four outcomes he defines for how people can respond to the word. So what he's doing there is teaching the disciples, these are the behaviors you need to be observing in a new believer to figure out if that faith is the real deal or not. Teaching sessions. The Gospels are riddled with teaching sessions of Jesus pulling a couple of disciples together and getting them squared away. Anybody have any favorite ones that they can think of that maybe resonate with you? I like the one where he pulls, I think it's James and John aside and says, okay, the last shall be first. You got it all backwards, right? And that was a perfect teaching moment. There's others. Anybody got any that they can think of?
When the disciples tried to prevent the children from approaching Jesus.
Good one, yep. Anybody else? But anyway, you know we've got many of them. I didn't try to list a whole bunch of them. And then stretching. Jesus was a master of using stretching techniques. He tells the story in Matthew of the parables of the bags of gold, which you probably remember. This is the master, has 3 servants. He's going away on a journey. He gives all 3 servants the opportunity to grow in responsibility and confidence. 2 of them embrace it, and they deliver, and they earn the master's joy. The other one says, I want no part of this. I'm not going to even touch it. And he earns the master's wrath. So that was Jesus talking about how we stretch people. But Jesus didn't just talk about it, he did it too. In Mark, we hear about how he sent the 12 core disciples out in groups of 2 to do teaching and preaching missions and healing. This was something that was completely out of their skill set at that point, a huge stretch for all of them, but yet they all came back as winners. And then he takes it another level, because Luke tells us that after this he sent out 72 other followers, and they expanded and did the same thing, and many of them came back with strength profiles as well. So what he was doing here was making sure that he had as many people with as many strengths as possible. If you remember at the beginning of Acts, after Judas Iscariot commits suicide, the disciples get together and they nominate 2 people that they're going to choose from to be the 12th apostle to replace Judas, and they eventually pick Matthias. Luke does not tell us the names of any of the 72 that were sent out, but I would speculate that both of those nominees were in that group, because Jesus had built a deep bench for the apostles, so when they needed a new starting player, they didn't have far to go. Okay. The third principle I talk about in the book is called hire for quality. This one I don't go into too much depth about, but I just felt that I had to talk. We're talking about so much about team leadership. We have to talk about how you put a team together in the first place. The problem with this is that doing that process is highly variable. Depends on what organization you're in. Some leaders have the opportunity to decide who's on their team. Others have no input at all. So I couldn't give any universal guidance, but I did say this. I said, leaders should understand the 2 dimensions of what I call a quality hire and use whatever influence they do have to get benefits out of that. The first dimension, again, is the one you're probably familiar with when we talk about a quality hire. That's somebody who has the expertise in the core functions of the job they're being hired into, right? The second one is a little more strategic, and I don't know a lot of people think about this, and this is when you're interviewing people or looking at their resumes, look beyond the core requirements of the job. See if they've got any strengths or potential strengths that your team lacks in some other area, whether it's part of that job or not. That way, you've got the most versatile team possible with as many different strengths as possible. So no matter what task you're asked to do, somebody on that team can step up and do it. Now, how did Jesus apply this principle? Again, this one's a little harder to point to directly. He obviously had the opportunity to select whoever he wanted, and he used that to good effect. And we do see that he very intentionally picked specific people to join his team that were going to fill some niche that he wanted. Libby even asked me the other day, well, why did he pick Judas? Judas filled a niche that he needed. The scriptures said that he was going to be betrayed by one of his own. Whether he knew that was Judas up front or not, I don't know, but he knew that Judas had something that he needed to make that team. Again, The Chosen does a pretty good job too of showing, and they're taking some creative license, but they show how he picked these people out of their lives. I did a little research on the history of the disciples before they were called, and a lot of them there's not much documented about their lives, but scholars have dug in and made some guesstimates. And we know, of course, there were several fishermen. The scholars suggested at least one of them, and I don't know which one it was probably a fisherman business leader. So he was already owned a business and had leadership skills that Jesus brought in. We know there was a former tax collector. There were 2 former zealots. There was Judas Iscariot, who probably had commercial experience. So he brought all those people in to make his team. I don't know if anybody's got any other thoughts on how this principle applies. Yeah.
But I think of it as God, and therefore Jesus was always creating a team that couldn't have accomplished it without his power. And so in some ways I always thought he was picking the least likely, because he was trying to set a model that through him all is possible.
You are leading up to a point that's coming, so thank you very much. Let's segue.
Good transition.
Anybody else? Okay. So that takes us to the final step in the process and the grand finale. You've defined the task properly. You know your people inside and out. Now you have to decide who's the right choice to do a specific task. Okay, the right choice revolves around the last 2 principles, number 4 and number 5. Number 4 is put your people in a position to succeed, and number 5 is don't put your people in a position to fail. And I know someone is thinking it, and before you say it, these are not the same thing said 2 different ways. They're kind of like first cousins or the 2 sides of the coin. They're closely related to each other, but they are distinct. And in simple terms, this is how I define the distinction. Number 4 is a positive principle, which if you use it right, can enable success. Number 5 is a negative or a defensive principle because it's trying to prevent a failure. These 2 have to work in tandem, and they serve as a litmus test for the leader when he's trying to make this right choice. I'm going to show you that in a second. But before I do that, one lesson I learned way back in my academy days is that somebody can have all the ability to do a task in the world, but they might not have the will to do it. And if they don't have the will, they're probably not going to deliver the win for you. So every leader really needs to make that the last thing he looks at and make this a critical criteria for the choice. Is the person dedicated to getting this done or not? That just, again, I learned that the hard way. Okay, I put this all together in a little thing I created called the Make the Right Choice worksheet. This is just meant to be a visual aid that walks people through the whole process we've talked about end to end. And I'll go through it very quickly. Number 1 is the task objective. We already talked about that, so that goes back to principle 1. Number 2, after you've written the task objective, the leader needs to catalog what skills are required to do this task right. And he just basically lists them there and indicates which ones are critical. Notice we always have dedication to the task at the bottom. The third step is where he now goes to the know your people principle. And he says, okay, I know my people. How do they stack up against each of these requirements? Are they a strength, a gap, or a weakness? And then when you've done all that and you get down to the bottom here, this is where principle 4 and 5 come into play. You're going to ask yourself 2 critical questions to make the final decision. And the first one is actual principle 5 comes first. Ask yourself, am I putting this person in a position to fail? You need the answer to this question to be no, and it needs to be no quibbling. So in other words, if you say to yourself, well, I don't think I'm putting them in a position to fail, I think you are putting them in a position to fail. The rule I've come up with here is hard no or no go. Yes or no, black and white. If you get a no on that and you move on to the next step, now we flip it around and we use principle 4 and we ask the opposite question. Am I putting my candidate in a position to succeed? And now you're looking at it from a positive point of view, saying, with the skills that they bring and the requirements I have, are they in a position where they can make this happen and deliver good things? Most of the people at this point that have gotten to that stage are probably going to be some version of yes. And here you can be conditional with your answer. And in fact, the nuanced answers are helpful because it allows you to kind of stratify the people by that nuances, and the best one pops to the top. Once we've gotten through all that, now the leader should be in a position to make a right choice that's going to work. And notice I say a right choice, because you may have multiple candidates who pass the test. Sometimes you'll pick the best one, but not always. If you've got a lot of tasks going on, the best guy can't do all of them. So the leader's going to make a decision on how to optimize outcomes for the whole team and maximize the number of wins. But somebody, either way, they've got to pass these two tests, or they can't be the right person. All right, so Jesus. We already know what his objective was. We know he knows his people. When we're looking at his objective statement and what are the critical skills and abilities that were needed, I came up with two, and they're not, I kind of extrapolated. But one of them is an absolute commitment to his mission because of everything was required from him. And he's a couple cases of how he applied that. Here's a longer one. Can somebody help me with that one? You can help me with that one?
All right. As they were walking along the road, a man said to him, "I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." He said to another one, "Follow me." But he replied, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Still another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family." Jesus replied, "No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom."
Okay, I know most of you have heard that one. Clearly, I don't think Jesus doubted their sincerity about wanting to follow him. But he recognized that they had other distractions that were going to get in the way of this total commitment he needed. And he didn't put them in a position to fail. And then this other one, I know everybody knows this one. Can somebody over here read this one for me?
As Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus answered, "You know the commandments. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witnesses. You shall not defraud. Honor your father and mother." "Teacher," he declared, I have kept all these since I was a boy." And Jesus looked at him and loved him. "One thing you lack," he said. "Go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." Disheartened, the man said, by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions.
Okay, so again, Jesus loved this man. But when he put him to the test of commitment, the man failed the test. And Jesus had to do the hard no or no-go decision. And I think his tendency to follow that Principle 5 rule to the letter is what let him wade through all of the people that wanted to be his followers and get that core 12. All right, the second one, and this goes back to what I think you were driving at a few minutes ago. Jesus wasn't looking for learned people. He wasn't looking for powerful people. He was looking for people that had a real faith in what he was teaching and what he was doing and who he was. He needed that because he knew what was going to happen when he launched the church. He knew the stormy waters they were going to have to go through. And if they didn't have an absolute abiding faith in what they were doing and who he was, they would never be able to get it done. All of his close disciples had faith in him, or they wouldn't have been his close disciples. But not all of them had exactly the brand of faith that I think he was looking for. And we talked about Judas. Judas, I think, had a great deal of faith in Jesus, but it was misdirected faith because he didn't really understand what Jesus was trying to do. And he thought Jesus was he wanted Jesus to be somebody else and do something else. And that ultimately led to him being the betrayer. Similarly, Thomas, who was a close follower, after the resurrection, he still didn't get it, right? He said, I'll believe it when I see it face to face. And Jesus gave him that opportunity and then kind of said, well, blessed are those, who haven't seen and yet believed. And I think that was his way of telling him, you're disqualified as the right choice here. But there was one disciple who every time that faith moment came, in spite of all his personal flaws, and he had a lot, he always nailed that moment. Let's remember when Jesus called him to his fishing boat, he had once left their nets and followed him. You all know what I'm talking about. When he saw Jesus walking on the water, he immediately called out, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you on the water." "Come," he said, and he got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. Until he got fearful and then he started to sink. And then I think it was the Last Supper when Jesus was washing his disciples' feet, and this disciple refused Jesus' offer, and Jesus said to him, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." And his response was, "Well then, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." He had this ingrained faith in Jesus that always came out at this moment. But the clincher was this big moment here. Can somebody read me this one over here maybe?
I will. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, the rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven."
Okay, so we now call this, of course, the Great Confession. This was the moment when Jesus knew that Simon, now Peter, was the right choice. And of course, being Jesus, he made the right choice, because here we are 2,000 years later, and the church that Jesus envisioned is still doing the mission he set out for. Through turmoil, internal corruption, persecution, an increasingly secular world today, the church is still going out, teaching about Jesus, saving souls all the way to the ends of the earth. And that is the Messiah and leading to win. So,
Very good.
questions, comments, arguments, anybody?
Of course, Peter denying Jesus 3 times is obviously the contrast. It's cool to think about, because even though he was the right person, he screwed up a few times too, and yet God forgave him, and God was still completely behind him, and it was kind of neat to see the contrast.
And that's a great point. When we went to the Passion play a year ago, they made a central point in the play of contrasting Peter's failure and how he responded to it with Judas's failure and how he responded to it. Judas was overcome by grief, couldn't get past it, and killed himself. Peter came out stronger as a result of it, and so again, Jesus saw what was in him and knew that he would come back, and he did, of course. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed. You may have already addressed this, but I was just wondering, is passion encased in faith as far as what you're talking about here, like passion for work, or I guess it would be passion for Christ?
Well, yeah, you missed the beginning. You did miss the structure of the book. The discussion about Christ is a case study I included. So I didn't talk about probably 60% of the rest of the book, because this is not a business class. But I wanted to talk about what was in my book and how Jesus applied it. So yeah, if you're talking in a different environment, the lessons are all the same. And that's one point I make early on. And I probably said he every time I was referring to an unnamed leader. It's just because I learned to speak English that way 50 years ago. This is good for men, it's good for women, it's good for black, it's good for white, it's good for Jew, it's good for Gentile, any organization you work for. The principles I'm talking about are universal. So you substitute Jesus' story with your own story, and you can almost make your own case study saying, how do I do each of these steps? Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I do want to ask for 30 seconds for one shameless promotion moment. Okay. If you're interested in reading the book, or you think there's someone else that might be interested, especially somebody younger who's just starting to develop their leadership stuff, The book is available on both Amazon and Barnes & Nobles now, as well as some other online sites. And we are going to have a book signing at the Woodlands Mall on Veterans Day. I'm trying to bring in the military aspect of the book there. So if you're around that day and would like to stop by, we'd love it. Or if you know anybody else who might like to come talk to me about the book, please let them know. And that's it. I'll turn it back over to Vince, wherever he is.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Great job.
Yeah.